You're listening to Make Planning Make Sense. My name is Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro Planning Consultancy.
And I'm Alex Roth, a planner at Centro. Welcome back to the show.
We are very excited for the interview that we have to share with you next week. But to set the scene, we want to make sure everyone is up to speed on the basics of how decisions are made in UK town planning. So for this episode, school is back in session on the core concepts of the planning balance.
We also want to say a huge thank you for the warm response that the podcast has received so far. Already over 50 followers on Spotify alone. Please share the podcast with your colleagues and anyone else who might enjoy a bit of planning and development banter.
Absolutely, yes. A huge thank you. And our way of saying thank you is going to be that when we reach 150 followers on Spotify, we will have our first questions and answers episode. So please do spread the word.
Exciting. Yes, please do spread the word and keep sending your questions to podcast@centroplan.co.uk.
I honestly can't wait, and I think it's going to be so much fun, and insightful. Of course, Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy. Shall we jump in?
Let's jump in. So, Aaron, in previous episodes, we talked about how planning applications are to be determined by the local authority and in accordance with a development plan. But what does the process of assessing an application against the development plan actually look like? And what does the process of developing a proposal in accordance with the development plan look like? Start us off. What's the statutory basis for this process?
Yeah, so the statutory bedrock is at Section 38(6) of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act. And that says that decisions on planning applications must be made in accordance with the plan, as in the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise.
Okay, so you mentioned two things there against which development proposals are to be assessed in the decision-making process: development plan and material considerations. Let's start with the development plan. What is a development plan?
A development plan is a local spatial strategy. Normally that would be your local plan, and in Greater London it also includes the London plan. Just to note, that's currently the only statutory regional spatial development strategy. And the development plan can also include other documents like regional waste management strategies and things like that.
And what kind of guidance do they set out? Is it sort of a simple checklist of expectations against which a development proposal is to be assessed?
No, not really. The development plan isn't prescriptive in that sense. And there are a few main reasons for this. Policies can be subjective expectations, such as optimizing this or maximizing that. Policies can conflict with each other in practice. They might set out an ideal expectation that won't be possible on all sites. And some objectives are just more important than others, even though both are relevant for a given application.
So there's some, what you're describing, there's a bit of vagueness in the guidance that a development plan offers to developers, right? Can you describe that guidance a little more? Is it like an IKEA instructions manual of how to build your development? What level of detail of sort of guidance on development management does a development plan offer?
Branded content. No, just kidding. We don't have a sponsorship.
Sorry. Please sponsor us. No.
Yeah. Right. Okay. No. So is it like an instructions manual? The answer is quite simply no, but I'll go into a bit more detail. A development plan sets out broad objectives in strategic policies, for example, like delivering X number of homes, making places safe, inclusive, accessible, etc. And it also sets out more granular development management policies, like space standards for balconies, but even those more granular development management policies wouldn't be as precise as an instruction manual. So if we were to run with this IKEA metaphor, if development plans were like IKEA manuals, we would be in the realm of a zonal planning system. And if IKEA manuals were like development plans, then they would have instructions like, IKEA is committed to furniture assembly. Building bookshelves will be supported subject to sufficient evidence demonstrating the appropriateness of the shelf heights, the relative position of the pieces, and the sustainability of the materials.
Yeah,
you didn't see that in the notes yet, did you? But how true is that, right?
That is so true. I can't.
But like, jokes aside,
Wow.
For major developments, you can't say, well, I've done everything that the plan has asked, and therefore, before I submit the application, before I talk to the officer, I know that this major development is going to get permission.
Okay.
You're just not going to get to that level.
For each development, if I can carry on this manual analogy, it's not sort of directly from development plan to clear expectations to detailed design. And this relates to what we've talked about in previous episodes. There's that next step in the UK planning system of interpreting the planning policies in context. I'll note for our international listeners that development plan in the UK differs from a zoning map that you might see in certain parts of the US, or in Germany, a Bebauungsplan that we have in Germany, because our UK development plan stops short of prescribing land use and intensity of use for individual plots of land. As we've discussed in the UK, there's that next step of interpreting the development plan in context and understanding what do the policies actually mean in terms of what the acceptable use and design is for my plot of land.
Yeah, a development plan in the UK does have all these expectations, but it's also, I don't know, it's a bit squishier than that. It's sort of like, well, yeah, we have this plan, but you can come to us with a different idea or a different proposal that gets as close as possible toward the objectives in the development plan, or something else entirely. And we can have a look at this and we can have a consideration. So the process really relies on the professional judgment of the decision maker. And this professional judgment is what makes the UK town planning system a discretionary system.
So there's that greater degree of flexibility and bespoke approach when compared to a more zonal system. Going back to the statutory foundations for our UK planning system, there's the development plan, and there's that other second thing that you mentioned, which decision makers need to have regard for in assessing development proposals. What was that thing again?
Material considerations.
That's right.
Yeah, and material considerations are basically anything that's reasonable and lawful for a decision maker to take into account in decision making. So a material consideration can be a document like the MPPF, the PPG, the supplementary guidance documents published by planning authorities. And material considerations can also be spatial constraints on site. And because we have a common law system, court judgments constitute case law, which is also a material consideration. So the development plan has primacy, but at the same time, you're allowed to depart from the development plan to be sure.
Yeah, I'm sure we can spend ages discussing what is and what isn't a material consideration.
Rather not.
But I want to move on from that, and I want to just ask, why do we need these material considerations? Why isn't the development plan enough, so to speak?
Ultimately, the system is designed to acknowledge that the built environment is more complex and contextual than a development plan can capture. And I want to give another shout out to Jane Jacobs here, because she really takes this complexity to heart, and she has a lot of words for the humility that's sometimes lacking in town planning. Now, that was 1960s New York, but it's incredible, so good.
And is that sort of supportive of a more bespoke, flexible, discretionary planning system?
I can say I think that was the intention. Yeah, absolutely.
So we've summarized the statutory basis for decision making. We have our development plan. We have all these material considerations. How does a decision maker go about correctly approaching these? Is there a process decision makers are expected to follow in exercising their professional judgment on whether a development proposal accords with the development plan and material considerations?
So, very broad brush, the courts have said that a decision is correctly reached and lawful as long as the decision maker has done three things.
Yeah.
First, due regard. And regard is the French verb, you're just having sight of it.
Je regarde.
I see you.
I see, you're right. Yeah, exactly.
Second, giving due weight to all relevant material considerations. And that is where a lot of the rest of the conversation, I think, is going to go. And then third, you can't be unreasonable or appear unreasonable in your decision making.
Yeah, the definition I read is a reasonable person acting reasonably.
I love it, don't you? That sounds...
So there's two criteria to fulfill. You have to be a reasonable person, which we are, I would say. We're a consultancy of reasonable planning consultants here at Centro. And the second criteria is to be acting reasonably.
I wonder what would happen if there was an unreasonable person acting reasonably.
Would that count?
Would we know?
That would fail the test, I think. Would we know if they're unreasonable?
Because we're judging it, right?
Yeah.
We're external to that person's unreasonable brain.
Yeah.
But they've acted reasonably.
Has anybody
Write
us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk?
Are you a reasonably acting unreasonable person? Write to us.
Yeah.
So
Have you ever encountered an unreasonable decision maker acting reasonably?
right. So
Okay, so not an all too narrowly defined process by the courts, right?
it's very squishy.
They haven't narrowed it down all that much, right?
They really haven't narrowed it down much. No, the process relies on this concept of a planning balance. And the planning balance is this exercise undertaken by a decision maker when determining the applications. And in undertaking a planning balance, a decision maker has to say, okay, how much weight does each of these considerations get? And that weight can shift by adjusting the weight afforded to a policy or to a material consideration or to an element of the proposal. And with some limitations, the weight that's afforded to each of these elements or each of these documents is squarely in the authority of the decision maker. And just to note, I guess, at this point, that is an incredible amount of work, right? That currently needs to start from scratch for each and every application that a decision maker needs to assess.
Interesting. Aaron, I just want to note here that since you mentioned it's an incredible amount of work, right? How does that planning balance also play into the process of developing a proposal? How do we come in as planning agents to bring in that planning balance at perhaps the earlier stage before it even reaches the decision maker?
I think it really goes back to this idea that we've touched on before, that it's really helpful to have a planning agent there from the very conception of a project.
Well, just interesting to know, I think, that the planning balance not only shapes the decision-making process once it reaches the local authority, but it also shapes the development of that proposal with the design team and with us acting as the planning agents, right?
We're often leading the development team and advising on policy expectations, right? How many 3-bed units should this have? But we're also advising on risks because there are going to be trade-offs that need to be made. So it's about getting the right balance and making sure that the choices are evidenced and justified.
Okay, so some things take primacy over others. Some things have more weight than others in the planning balance. How do decision makers start making sense of the weights that should be ascribed?
Yeah, see, should is kind of a tricky word because the system relies on the professional judgment or wisdom or vision or priorities, perhaps, of a decision maker. Now, that said, the government does try to guide decision makers in the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework.
Okay.
And the NPPF sets out national priorities in planning and how certain elements of certain proposals should be weighted. And the NPPF says that decision makers are to apply a presumption in favor of sustainable development.
Interesting. Oh, well, interesting. Let's unpack that a little bit. So there's a presumption in favor of sustainable development. So the NPPF, the national government, is ascribing weight to sustainable development. And the development plan defines sustainable development, right? And development proposals are supposed to the best of their ability, accord with the development plan. So in setting that presumption in favor of sustainable development, isn't the national government and the NPPF just setting a presumption in favor of any development, since development is supposed to be sustainable and accord with the development plan?
It all sounds a bit circular, yeah. The thing is, the decision makers sometimes don't want to ascribe any positive weight to elements of a proposal that, quote, just accord with a given policy. But those elements are features of sustainable development because the development plan defines sustainable development for the plan area, and therefore those elements should carry a presumption of at least some positive weight in the planning balance. The presumption in favor of sustainable development is kind of this helpful reminder to look at a scheme in the round.
Okay, yeah. I guess that brings us back to our definition of development plan in it being not a checklist. But nevertheless, I think that sustainable development, that's still a pretty sort of high level priority. What about more specific priorities?
It does have some more specific priorities. The NPPF speaks to the weight that certain kinds of development that's in the national interest should be afforded. Green belts, mineral operations, etc. And what the NPPF is really grabbing everyone's shoulders about and shaking them and saying, this is really, really, really important, is the delivery of homes.
Okay.
So it gives guidance on the weight that is to be afforded to certain types of residential development proposals. For example, great weight is to be given to the benefit of homes on windfall sites within settlements. Substantial weight is to be given to the value of homes on suitable brownfield land within settlements. And then it goes on to say, actually, proposals for which should be approved unless substantial harm would be caused. And the MPPF is also the basis for the minimum housing delivery requirements.
Okay, so the government is saying these things are really important. In what circumstances do these really important objectives that should be given greater weight give us sort of a little bit of leeway to say, okay, maybe the development proposal doesn't fulfill all the expectations in the development plan, but it fulfills these really important strategic objectives that the national government has set as a priority. How does that how does that work in terms of these priorities kind of overpowering, if you will, the development plan or the local authority?
The relevant weights in the MPPF should be used in all decision making, even when a council is totally up to date on their local plan and totally on track for housing delivery. So in general, it's setting priorities rather than overpowering a development plan. But what I think you're talking about is the tilted balance. And the tilted balance is not something that sounds great to explain in precise detail on a podcast, but basically the tilted balance provision is engaged if there are no relevant policies in the development plan for a given application, or if the development plan is out of date, and that could be by virtue of being more than 5 years old, or by virtue of failing the housing delivery test, or by virtue of the LPA not being able to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. When the tilted balance is engaged, it says, unless there would be a strong reason to refuse permission on the grounds of unacceptable impacts on certain protected areas, and unless the adverse impacts would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits, then assessed against the MPPF policies read as a whole, then permission should be granted.
Is it fair to say that it comes down to, hey, local authority, it looks like you're failing on housing delivery. It looks like you're not doing very well. So can you just loosen up a little bit in terms of your scrutiny in your decision-making process? Can you just relax just the tiniest bit to help us meet some of these very important strategic objectives that we've ascribed great weight to in the NPPF? Is that fair? A fair summary of the sort of intention of the tilted balance as a housing delivery mechanism?
Yeah, that's essentially right. The tilted balance is the government saying, look, decision-making as normal is not working here. Unless the adverse impacts are that bad, then you should grant permission. For housing provision, to me, it's the government saying that it's better to get some homes approved than whatever's been going on in local decision-making so far.
Okay, so the national government has told us through the NPPF that, okay, these priorities are really important. You know, these have significant weight, substantial weight, great weight, right? And that's giving decision makers a sense of what weight to attribute to different considerations in the planning balance and in the decision-making process. But how are we supposed to understand the magnitude of weight? You know, is substantial more than great? Is substantial greater than great? Is significant greater than substantial? How do we know how much? Can we quantify that weight at all? I mean, I'm thinking this isn't sort of, you know, a cost benefit analysis where we can ascribe quantities. Like, how are we supposed to understand the magnitude of weight here in the planning balance?
No, it's a great question, because we have to remember first that the planning balance is an holistic exercise, and the amount of weight for each consideration is described qualitatively for exactly that reason. The decision maker needs to exercise their professional judgment in deciding the relevant policies and priorities, as well as the most salient considerations, and then exercise an overall balance of the considerations in the round.
Okay, so
did that answer? No, it didn't answer the question.
I think it did. Well, I guess, Aaron, I shouldn't be surprised that the terms great weight, substantial weight, significant weight have some room for interpretation and can be subjective and can be interpreted by the decision maker, and the decision maker has some leeway for maneuvering with those terms. Like,
maneuverability is a much better word than squishiness, which I think is what I've said earlier.
Considering that maneuverability, you'd think that all decision makers would agree that if something is ascribed great weight in the NPPF or furthers a strategic objective in the development plan, it should be given great weight in the planning balance, no? Can you give us a little bit of an example of how these weights actually get interpreted in practice?
In practice, Decision makers are often able to find a lawful pathway to a decision even when taking these great or significant positive or negative weights into account. And that can be true even in cases where these positive or negative weights actually fall on the other side of the planning balance from where the decision maker has landed. It's really rare, for example, for a decision maker to write up their assessment and say, you know what, checkmate, I would have refused this application, but my hands are tied by NPPF policy X. It's more common, I'd say, for a decision maker to be able to say, well, notwithstanding the great weight afforded to X, I'm going to land on the other side of that balance.
So that was a lot. Yeah, so we've touched on a lot. So we talked about development plans, material considerations, the planning balance, weights. Can you just briefly summarize all that for our listeners, Aaron?
Lord, I can try it. All right. It would be worth a few hot takes on flexibility, comprehensiveness, and insufficient priority setting.
Okay.
Let's unpack this after a quick break.
We'll be right back. Welcome back.
What a break.
Yeah. We promised you hot takes. Aaron, how do we break this down for our listeners? What are the takeaways here?
Right. We've got flexibility, comprehensiveness, and insufficient priority setting. I think you can imagine because, we're such rabble rousers. We love a hot take. We're going to spend a lot of time with the priority setting question. But let's start with flexibility here.
Yeah, I think helpful as well to break it down into those three themes. Flexibility, a positive attribute of our UK planning system, right? The discretionary planning system affords us a degree of flexibility in sort of bringing forward a city one development at a time. We have a great deal of flexibility, adaptiveness, and we can go with a more bespoke approach.
That's the idea. I mean, to me, the difference between a discretionary system and a zonal system is a difference in process. In either type of system, you can justify deviations from whatever expectations have been set out. It's just a different way of going about it. And the intention of a discretionary system, especially in a simplistic contrast to a zonal system, is really understandable because that flexibility is a really valuable thing.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Aaron. I wonder if any of our New York planners, if we have any New York planners listening, can you tell us if a zoning application to change the zoning ordinance is as complex, if you're familiar with our system, if it's as complex as getting a planning permission? I imagine that to change the zoning ordinance, to change the zoning map, to do a zoning application would be quite a complex process. I know that it's not as common as getting a planning permission like we do here in the UK for every development. But that's interesting. It would seem to me like that's a bit more of a complex process. As you say, Aaron, that gives us an advantage of our more discretionary planning system, which is you don't have to go through such a complex process each time for each development, right?
Well, as I say, that was the idea. And I think that it's an admirable idea. I'm not sure that a discretionary system is really less complex. What a discretionary system effectively does is that it means you're having that rezoning petition or that exemption petition for every single element of every single application, because the burden of proof is on the applicant. And basically it's saying, we've got this development plan, but otherwise all bets are off.
There's not that status quo to fall back on of a zoned approach where you can say, all right, that's definitely acceptable here.
Yeah, our discretionary system is so flexible that you kind of need to prove everything each time.
Okay, but staying on the positive side here, I would just say I think I would make my personal position clear on this. I think I do see the value in our discretionary planning system. I wouldn't say, there's a lot of people out there advocating to move toward a zoning system. Centre for Cities, for example, there's a lot of people advocating for a zonal system in the UK or just to move in that direction. And I would say the reason for our points of critique here and the points we're going to raise here are because personally, I do believe that there's value in that discretionary system. And I think that we can improve it and continue to refine it. I don't think we need to abandon it completely, right?
I wouldn't grant the premise that our choices are strictly binary between the discretionary system that we have and a zonal system. And yeah, there are aspects of the discretionary system that are really, really positive. And one of those is that opportunity for dialogue about design and landscape, public realm, coordination between landowners. And another is that opportunity to allow for unique or just maybe unanticipated applications. But we need to have a closer look at how the intention for flexibility has actually, paradoxically, resulted in a system that is extremely tightly controlled, yet struggles to acknowledge the trade-offs that are inherent in the development plans that we work with.
Yeah, I guess. And also, before we get accused of being too critical, I did just think of another benefit of the flexibility of our discretionary planning system. And I think is something that's come out also in research is that the flexibility in terms of value capture, of using more bespoke approach to understand like the value that can be captured in terms of the design and what can be provided through development in terms of public benefits and public realm and contribution to infrastructure and SIL, S106, just value capture in general, to have a more bespoke approach towards that. Whereas like if you have a more blanket approach in the zoning system, it's kind of difficult to understand, okay, this specific site, this particular development, if we allow this, it's going to generate this much value. And then that we can kind of skim this much off the top of that for the public benefit. Like having a more bespoke approach to value capture, I think it can be a very positive thing.
Our system does include value capture, yeah. And there are going to be site-specific objectives that certainly seem sensible to deal with ad hoc.
Right.
But in the system that we have now, the expectation is to ensure sufficient value capture, but we're also not sure what it is until we see it. Mm-hmm. And that gums up the decision-making process, and delivery suffers. What I'm really trying to get at here is that objective expectations can still ensure value capture. And IMHO, the state should say what the minimum expectations are upfront. Mm-hmm. And then case by case, prioritize delivery over perfection.
Okay. Yeah. So the bespoke approach is good, but you're saying it creates a lot of uncertainty. We're just trying to provide some helpful feedback, you guys. All right. Some constructive feedback. We promise we're not all we promise we're not all critical, like 100% critical about the our planning system.
Not at all. I love my job.
Yeah.
I love the built environment. There are conversations, with our own clients, with our development teams, and with officers that are sometimes contentious because they're really important things and because people have really good points to raise. This isn't just us sipping tea and being like, and another thing, there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of balance, but there are certain things that, again, we want to contribute to the conversation as practitioners that sometimes just, we don't necessarily see in the public conversations.
Absolutely. So moving on to the next point, Aaron, comprehensiveness. What does our discretionary planning system give us in the way of comprehensiveness?
I guess by definition, everything.
No stone.
Get it? Comprehensiveness?
It's no stone unturned, right?
No stone unturned. So this is sort of the nice way to look at the fact that everything needs to be evidenced on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm. We're thorough, for sure.
Yes.
I mean, I do want to just note there are things that are not captured within policy that we then completely neglect, I would say.
Oh my God.
Right?
All right, go on.
I mean, I think this is bringing us way off topic, but I do have to say, like, within the framework that we operate, within the policies.
We need a button or something like rant alert.
Rant alert. Wait, derailing the conversation alert.
Can I just say one more thing?
But within the framework within which we operate, we are very, very thorough. In fact, maybe too thorough. Like we produce repetitive work, and sometimes we do things that you could classify as tick box exercises. But the thing is, there are certain things that are just not considered at all within policy. For example, so I watch Instagram Reels, I'll admit, and I sometimes get political ads for local councillors. And this was a councillor describing, look at all these betting shops around here. Like we don't have any authority in terms of land use to get rid of these.
Maybe what the council, I've not seen the ad, but maybe what the councillor might have been getting at is that planning is a forward-facing process. So you can't go into an existing built environment and retroactively make existing businesses or uses unlawful.
It's an important point, though, because planning can't just go in and say, this current arrangement of uses is distasteful, this is unseemly. We're going to retroactively make a lawful existing use unlawful and sponge it from the townscape.
Yeah. Okay.
It is a reactive governance system.
Yeah. We're very comprehensive about the things that are considered within our planning policy and within our frameworks. Obviously, there's gaps, but within that, like we are extremely
what we have decided
thorough,
is
right?
a planning consideration is going to be covered
exactly
in great detail.
Yeah.
So it's flexible,
It's comprehensive, and
insufficient in priority setting.
okay, so now we're getting to the critique.
These takes just get hotter and hotter as we go.
So insufficient priority setting. We're facing a housing crisis. We're facing a climate crisis. We need to deliver our way out of these things. And very important to that, priority setting.
Yeah, Alex, what's your main takeaway from that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the lack of priority setting is symptomatic of limitations on how much strategic planning we can do. My main takeaway is that in divorcing the practice of strategic policymaking from interpreting those policies in context, we have created a system where our cities come forward one development at a time. That often allows a really bespoke and flexible approach, and that has a number of benefits, as we've discussed. But it also often comes at the cost of a more strategic approach at times and coordination between developments.
Yeah. And so in that regard, housing delivery would be one of those strategic objectives that just isn't built in as an outcome.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, all the stuff that can't come forward one development at a time, all the stuff where you need a strategic coordinated approach, right? Things like housing delivery or regional transport, right?
I think that's absolutely the case. Or to put it another way, there are going to be inherent, unavoidable trade-offs, right, between these policy objectives. This actually reminds me of the conversation we had with Tom Slater, because there's this in London, out of London divide, and that actually tracks with the now versus back then divide. But let's say in Greater London, no, we can't have everything the way that the development plans are currently written. And that's okay. That's okay. This is exactly why we prepare a planning statement that says we have signposted an assessment that is reasonable, that is sound, that is defensible. Because the best thing that we can do for these decision makers who are being asked to assess all of this stuff, 3-4 dozen considerations in great detail, and then whip them into a planning balance, is to say, let us help.
Yeah.
Let us light that pathway to a sensible decision.
And of course, that feeds into the process of developing a planning proposal, because, I mean, how are developers and the design team supposed to know what to prioritize in bringing that proposal forward, right?
Absolutely. I don't think that the benefit would be just for decision makers. I think it would just provide a lot of clarity and some confidence in the development plan itself to express to applicants and decision makers what this should look like.
Right. And as we've discussed, I mean, the NPPF makes a start, and strategic objectives within development plans make a start as well at attributing some weight and setting some priorities in terms of policies, right? Is that doing enough in the way of priority setting, or what do you think?
Well, if we take a proactive governance approach and we ask, here's what the NPPF is saying, how is that affecting decision making?
Yeah.
I think we can see a pretty unsuccessful story.
Okay. Yeah, I guess how do we go about setting clear priorities in our discretionary system, though? Because I think a fundamental problem when you have a discretionary system, as we've discussed, even when you set these priorities in the NPPF and in the development plan, then there is still room for interpretation and maneuvering, as we've discussed, right, by the decision maker. So how do you kind of set clear priorities then? Because, I mean, with our discretionary system, it can feel sometimes like herding cats. Like the government is yelling, hey, great weight, this is important. And then, it's still subject to interpretation. What even is great weight?
Well, the way that we have it at the moment, there are so many possible decision-making pathways to a lawful decision, a perfectly acceptable lawful decision, and some of those pathways will lead to approval and some will lead to refusal. To answer your question, though, I think that policymaking is the place to start for better priority setting in our discretionary system. The NDMPs should do that if they become part of the development plan and if they're drafted with that intention.
Yeah, because I think that highlights a way for us to have more certainty without going into a zonal system, with setting policies that apply nationally, where there's not a lot of room for interpretation, and yet we don't have to go into the finer grain detail of like standards plot by plot. But then there's always still, even with national development management policies, there's always, with the best planning agent and, the best development proposal, there's always that 10% chance that the decision maker is just going to do something completely out of left field.
I'd be very happy working with a 10% chance of chaos, right? 10% is probably about where we should be. And Right now, I'd say the percentage is a lot higher.
Okay. So really providing greater certainty that even takes away the discretion or confusion that exists around some of these things.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And that's part of the value that we're adding as agents in the planning system that we work in. But also policymaking at the local level can do this now. There's no reason not to have a clearer priority setting, hand in hand with clearer expectations for value capture. And of course, we're going to be doing a policymaking episode for sure. Episodes maybe. I think that it'll be a lot of fun, and we're really keen to hear your thoughts as well. Dear listener, please do write in, because we're taking a perspective of planning agents, the perspective of practitioners.
Yeah.
And we want to be having these frank and honest conversations. But we understand that our perspectives are our own, and that we're contributing one perspective in a much larger discussion. So, Alex, what do you think? Have we just about covered it? Have we gone from granular to grandiose for the episode?
Yeah, and of course, we'll pick this up in coming episodes, in more detail. But if you have any questions for us, you can always write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk.
And we'll get that rant button installed.
Yes.
All right, that's a wrap. Class dismissed. Hopefully this was a helpful crash course for everyone on the planning balance here in the UK.
This stuff is so foundational to understanding UK town planning, and it tees up our conversations in the coming weeks. Join us next week for a discussion with Laurie Hancock, Director of Built Heritage and Townscape at ICENI.
This guy is brilliant, and we're very excited to share our conversation with Laurie with you.
Listeners, please tell your colleagues about the show. Our first community Q&A episode will drop once we reach 150 followers on Spotify. To all our current listeners and followers on all platforms, thank you so much for joining us.
And remember, our questions and answers episode needs questions, so please keep sending those to podcast@centroplan.co.uk. And until next time, I'm Aaron.
And I'm Alex.
See you next week.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch, then we'd love to hear from you. Please write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thank you so much for listening.